One of the misnomers about marketing is that it's about finding markets for products that you have. It's the reverse. It's about helping design products that the markets need.
What is marketing? It's about understanding your customer. If you put me into South Africa, I have no clue about anything because I've never lived there.
Being Indian is a natural advantage. Given how diverse India is, a successful piece of advertising content has to cut through. The great agencies know that they're not creating art. They're creating artistic advertising that's got to sell the brand eventually.
Hey there, welcome to Marketing Mavericks with Indie4You. Today we have Prashant Chacko with us, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of Godrej Consumer Products Limited. He's in Dubai and he heads that particular region for them. Prashant comes with a lot of experience and he's been at Unilever for 10 years. He's in Godrej for the last almost 10 years as well, and he comes with a lot of extensive experience. We unpack his journey from doing math and science to actually shifting to marketing. Talk a lot about how it is to actually go from a marketeer in India to abroad. And we unpack a lot of advice for young marketeers as well as agency owners and freelancers. Thank you so much for your time and welcome to the podcast, Prashant.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
I start off the conversation always by asking, how did you get into marketing? You, I believe, studied mathematics or science?
I think it was less about me deciding it to be my career choice rather than it happening almost by chance or happenstance, as they say. Yes, I did study mathematics, and after that I studied trading. Commodity trading was my big dream when I was passing out of college. And I was really fascinated by the concept of buying low and selling high and, making killings on commodity exchanges, etc. And I started my career in the commodity division of a company. And within no time at all, I think everything just kind of, it just dropped in my eye. I just did not enjoy the work at all. And coincidentally, in my management trainee stint, it made me do some marketing type projects. And I excelled in those where I would go out and meet users and find something interesting about what they are doing with our product or our competitor's product that our company didn't even know. The kind of feedback that I got about those little moments resulted in the company itself telling me that they felt I was better suited for a marketing kind of career rather than a commodity career. And that's when I started looking in that direction. Rest of it is history, right? So I've had the opportunity to work in some really interesting brands, work with some fabulous marketeers, and it's a virtuous cycle from there, right? Because when you work on interesting work and have great mentors, it just becomes easy to take that path.
From the outside perspective, especially for all of young people, it feels like, somebody who spent 12 years in a Unilever will always have known that, marketing's like a core thing to me. And I say this because I speak to a lot of students. I do a bunch of workshops. Many of them, unfortunately, don't know what's the right path for them. In fact, I think right now it's more of a choice issue more than anything. Any advice for, young folks who just want to find out what?
I think it's a tricky one, right? And I personally feel that there's too much pressure being put when you're too young to make a decision on what you want to do and what you want to be. Right? I think that's a fact. That was a fact when I was in college, and I think it's even more of a fact today. And in a way, I think there's merit to the international or the American model where people actually go and work at a couple of things and then go and do a post-graduation, and then they choose a path. I think there's something there because I think however much you read about it or see your parents do it, until you've tried it for yourself, you don't fully understand whether it's for you or not. And I think people above a certain intellect can do a variety of things at a reasonable level, right? But it's about what can you do well and what would you like to do for a long time, right? So I would say don't put too much pressure on finding the answer upfront. Have a point of view on 2 or 3 things that you like. Hopefully have the luxury to try and then decide and let that little bit of a journey happen, right? Where you might move from a stream to another stream that's probably going to work out really well for you as well.
Fantastic. I want to now talk about the first jobs, a marketer does. Whenever I speak to CMOs on this podcast, there's a very common pattern of most of them having a sales gig in the first job itself. So is doing sales as your first job very important to be a marketer?
It's become the template in a way. But interestingly, it's a template in India. It's not the template globally. And that's the advantage of having worked outside of India, right? You get to see various models in various parts. I would say that the template in India is set more by consumer goods companies. And for consumer goods companies, 100%, I think that is the path. Because in consumer goods companies, except for a very small part of the business, it's hardly directly business to consumer. It's business to intermediary to consumer, right? And your best laid plans get lost, right? If that junction between you and the consumer is not working, right? So, and sales is where that is, right? Because you understand all the issues that can happen at a store, at a distributor. You can understand how big plans that brand managers present to you on PowerPoint don't translate to what, don't translate to the store, etc., right? So for me, that understanding is what a sales stint gives you in consumer goods businesses. And therefore, if you've really been reflective at that point in time, when you do get into marketing, you know that those constraints exist. And so you design accordingly, right? Or you design to solve those constraints, which just increases the chances of your marketing working. So from that standpoint, I think it's really valuable. It's interesting in the US, in Africa, people don't follow that path. People join sales and stay in sales, or join marketing and stay in marketing. And I've always felt that they do miss out on this aspect. I think it's because of the typical profile of people that are hired in India. The people that are hired in India, especially by consumer goods companies or for marketing, large marketing companies, is people who are very comfortable with numbers and operation. Therefore, intellectually, a sales job is very doable, right? Because there's a lot of number chasing. And then the marketing role after that is also possible because, there's that base level flair. Whereas what I find in other countries is that people with a small, more analytical bent of mind tend to do sales, finance, operations kind of roles. And people with a more creative bent of mind go straight into marketing. And very often a marketing conversation internationally is all about the creative and hardly anything is discussed about the numbers.
Very interesting. I wanted to ask you about where marketing is today, right? But if let's say I go 20 years back in time and I think about marketing, it's like ads and campaigns and creative things and, pretty much on the creative side, brand building, etc. Today, you talk about MarTech, data, analysis, experimentation, A/B testing, become very analytical. Again, I see young folks confused that if I'm creative, is marketing still for me? Or if I'm analytical, is marketing still for me?
Mine is quite a counterintuitive answer. Very often when you read a lot about everything having changed, you realize that the core hasn't, and it's more the tools and what surrounds it that changes, right? So just to go back to your example, I think advertising was always the icing on the cake for marketing, right? And yes, as a consumer, that may be the only aspect of marketing that you see. And therefore, it seems like marketing is all about the advertising. But the advertising only happens at the end of the chain. A lot of the analytic, a lot of the rigor, a lot of the, meeting people, understanding what they need, designing products, choosing for pricing, doing the testing, all of that always used to happen. What's different today is that the tools are much more intuitive. There's a lot more written about these tools and these techniques. Therefore, more and more people are aware of these concepts and probably use it to set up their own small website, etc. These tools always existed. I mean, versions of A/B testing have always existed, right? And I was doing it 20 years back. We used to call it something else, except that we would make the choice before the consumers see it in the past, rather than today, the choice is made after consumers see it. Right? That's the only difference. But invariably, there were always multiple ideas that became one. So the core hasn't changed is what I still believe, because I've in a way spent time in both eras where the core hasn't changed. Some of the tools have changed. Some of the mindsets have changed. I think the ability to take risk is slightly there more than it was earlier. It was slightly more risk averse where you would test something to perfection before you put it out. But now you're willing to take it as it goes and improve on the fly. Some of these mindsets may have changed, but the core hasn't, is what I still feel.
That's a very interesting perspective. This is the first time I think I'm getting this angle. You joined Unilever pretty earlier time of your career. And a lot of, aspiring marketeers think of that as like the place to be. It's like whenever I speak to people who've worked there for a long time, they say it's very cool. What's your advice to anybody who wants to get into a company like this?
Let me try and answer that with how my interview went, right? Because I was exactly that profile that you mentioned. I had done commodity trading till then, right? So I had just no clue about this. I had no interest prior to that either. I was giving it a shot. I just think in my interview, I demonstrated curiosity and I demonstrated an ability to just go deeper and deeper into a problem, right? Because eventually, like you said, Unilever is a school, right? It's a university for teaching marketing. And therefore, if it's a university for teaching marketing, they're not really looking for ready marketeers, right? They're looking for raw material. Therefore, I treated it more like a college interview than a company interview, right? Because anyway, it's the college that I'm joining, right? The feedback I got later was that was exactly what they were looking for. They were looking for people who were curious. Because if you're curious and ask questions and are willing to spend a lot of time doing that, you will understand the consumer and the business well. And then the rest of it will flow.
Fantastic. I think it all really often comes down to the little things, and curiosity, as somebody who also runs a creative shop, when I look at young people, look at curiosity, right? And that in itself is more than enough and sets you apart. Within Unilever, you spent over a decade. But what's interesting is you moved countries, right? I think you went to South Africa and then the MENA region. Can you tell me a little bit about the experience there? Because what is marketing? It's about understanding your customer. And if you put me into, South Africa, I have no clue about anything, because I've never lived there.
It's very interesting. I personally think that being Indian, right, is a natural advantage, given how diverse India is. Just as imagine, right, if you've lived all your life in Amritsar, going and spending 3 years in Chennai is as much of a culture shock as moving to Johannesburg. Right. And those are just 2 parts of India. There are many, many more diverse parts of India. The second thing is, again, it's slightly counterintuitive. I genuinely feel that being an outsider is an advantage in marketing. Right. Because as an outsider, you see regular habits and regular practices as unusual because they are not regular to you. Right. As a local, you take them for granted. As an outsider, they strike you as being different. And therefore, I think being an outsider has been a big advantage for me in Africa, Middle East, the US, and all of these places. And therefore, I'm able to ask slightly different questions. And I think it's in these challenges and these contrasts and these paradoxes in a way that real opportunity lies. And that's where insight comes in.
Fantastic. If I can ask you to go a little bit deeper, everybody talks about you need to talk to customers, be curious about them, understand them, and use the right tools and tech to really grill down what they want. But let's say I'm a marketer in a startup doing 0 to 1, or if I'm a founder doing 0 to 1, right? I'm often unsure if my target group has enough data, or if I'm targeting a particular country, maybe I don't have data sets. How many should I speak to? What is the benchmark of that cohort, right? To make a decision that, okay, now I understand my customer.
Let me try and give a framework for this, right? So I think in trying to solve or try to understand the consumer, there's the what set of questions and the why set of questions. What do large numbers of people buy? What do they pay? Right? When do they buy? It's in that space, all of which are best solved quantitatively. So that's where you need big data. All right. However, big data does not help you with the why questions. And you need a marriage of what and why to be able to make something useful for the consumer. Now, a why question is always best solved in meeting people because it involves doing an interview like in a way we're doing now. It's a conversation, a bit of an in-depth understanding, right? You get to the motivations, right? Okay, you chose this versus that. Why did you do that, right? What did you think of? What options did you have? Do you choose A in certain circumstances and B in certain circumstances? So it's the marriage of those two that really gets you an insight. And I think this process is true whether you're a multi-billion-dollar multinational or a startup. I think that the decision to go and meet users individually is not because of lack of data. You got to do it anyway, but you got to ask the right question. You shouldn't try and go to consumers and try and build a what hypothesis on it. You can't meet 10 people and say that 70% of women wake up at 6 a.m. Because that's just very bad statistics, let alone anything else. Right? But you can say, you can build a hypothesis on people wake up at 6 a.m. because they'd like to get work out of the way before the rest of the family gets up, let's say, right? And there's a why, there's an interesting insight on why. So your question, therefore, of how many is enough, that question is valid for the what questions. So because it's big data, you need statistically large, valid samples. For the why question, is not really about how many you meet. It's about meeting a small number, and small could be 5 to 10, but choosing them for certain diversity of background or behavior, right? And the real question to ask is how much time have you spent with them, rather than how many have you met? Because you're trying to understand the why rather than a what. The best practice from here is to go back and quantitatively validate the why, which you can do through a customized test, like an A/B test. You can have, let's say, two alternative whys for why they choose a software product, let's say. And you A/B test those two, and you understand straight away, okay, this is the better hypothesis than that, and therefore let me go with that. So quantitative, qual, and quant. I would say that triangle, if you keep doing regularly, chances are you won't go wrong.
That was incredible. I often look for very articulate and to the point and action oriented points. And this was like brilliant. It's like a proper framework I can use to kind of structure if I'm doing something even tomorrow. So thank you so much for that. Now that you've worked outside the country, as somebody, if you can kind of tell us what do you think about India? What are the things which an Indian customer is similar to with the average, global or any particular region? And in what areas is it very different?
Again, slightly controversial, right? I would again start off by saying that a lot of consumer behavior is similar in the sense that at the very heart of it, people have problems, right, that they need to solve, and they buy products or services to solve those problems. And then they move on with their life till the problem comes up again, and they buy the product or service again. And that's a repeating cycle, right? Problem could be as diverse as my clothes are dirty, right? To I am hungry, to we need transportation. So those could be the problems. The fundamentals still remain that you go out, get a product or a service to solve it, and you move on. It's only the nuances that I feel that are different, right? But the core is fundamentally the same. In the nuances, I don't think it's right to say people are this and B people are that, because everything is contextual, right? Your behavior while trying to buy a coffee sachet could be quite different from your behavior when you're trying to buy washing powder or trying to buy shampoo. I would just say that in all such conversations, I have always asked my teams to spend time trying to think of what is similar, because that is typically where you'll get the big insights. And then in the iteration of it, you can find the nuances. Because if you start off trying to find what is different, you will find 100 things that are different. Then you have a mess because think about it. Imagine if you're designing something for India and you start off by finding differences, right, between all the subregions of India. You will go mad, right, trying to design one thing for India because there are so many differences. Instead, on the other hand, if you start off by saying what is common across a lot of India, right, you will get 80% right. And then you can say, let me make these slight little nuances so that in this region, because it has softer water, let me design it slightly differently. Of this region, it has harder water, let me design it slightly differently. But 80% of the core is the same. Or with advertising, you might make minor changes in cast or language, but you could use the same ad across. I genuinely believe that differences are there and important, but similarities are more important, right, as a marketeer.
I think very cool. I've not thought about this from this perspective. In emerging markets as well as developed markets, what's the difference there, right? Do you feel that marketing strategies tend to change when you're marketing to such two different standard of livings across consumers?
The fundamental difference, right, between developing and developed markets is income, is per capita income or GDP per capita. That's the fundamental difference, right? And if you plot multiple categories, right, on a scale of GDP per capita globally versus category penetration, you'll find almost linear relationships, right? And these are true across a variety of categories, be it tourism, be it consumer goods, etc., etc. There's almost a linear line between how wealthy people get and what they tend to consume. What that fundamentally means is that eventually people's needs are similar. As people's income rises, they tend to mirror other regions of similar income, right? Or all lower income countries tend to follow certain patterns of category penetration, which means that largely people are similar or the needs are similar across the world. What changes are things like product maturity. In a developed market, right, products that may be very nascent in a developing country could be the norm. And therefore, you have to push yourself harder to innovate. You have to push yourself harder to think of something new. Or let us say the kind of channel fragmentation is probably a little more in the higher income consumers than it is for the lower income consumers. And therefore, you've got to think of your advertising and media strategies in a slightly more nuanced manner to really be effective. Those are the areas where the changes happen. But again, the absolute fundamentals remain the same. You've got to be creating products or services that truly delight and solve real problems. You've got to make them very easily available to buy it, and you've got to make them very easily available to remember or recognize. Those are constant, whichever world you operate in.
Interesting. If I am a Indian brand and I want to market to these countries, and that's the dream, right, for a lot of us right now building, how do I know that I'm ready for international markets? Because as you just said, my product, which is flying off the roof in India, is probably a norm in America or Europe, right? But I have an ambition that I want to grow beyond borders. What's your advice there for anybody, trying to do the same?
One of the misnomers about marketing is that it's about finding markets for products that you have. For me, it's the reverse. It's about helping design products that the markets need, then getting it to the market. Because if the product market fit is not there, right? There's no point burning billions of dollars behind it because it's not going to succeed. So invariably for me, all these conversations have to start off not from I have this and therefore where can I sell it, right? It should start off from what will sell or what is needed and go backwards and design for it. Chances are you will succeed, right? If you get the basics right. So there's that mental switch to be gotten right very early. The corollary to that is to the point I made earlier about kind of, GDP versus penetration rates. If you really think of it that way, you'll find 5 other countries in similar situations as you, where your product may be as novel as it is in India, right? So I would say that the answer need not be that you always have to launch in the US. The answer could be that you could launch in other countries, right, which are in a similar economic situation as you are, where your product could be equally innovative, right? And you might make more money there with what you have, right, than in the US. So I think you have to look at it both ways, right? Either if I have this product, where is it as good a fit as it is for India today? And if USA is where I want to be, then where are those users and what problem do they have that I can solve with my know-how? So it's the manage of that I guess that you'll find the answer.
You also mentioned the second point was channel fragmentation, right? I want to understand a little bit more about that because typically I'm assuming you mean that there is more digital penetration or more things people use because at least in India, everybody's coming to India for the next billion users, right? And
yeah, of course.
We actually also have crazy channel fragmentation right now in India. Trying to understand what you mean by that between emerging markets.
It's just that I think emerging markets have higher penetration of e-commerce than India. A lot of offshoots of e-commerce, which is quick commerce, social commerce, etc., are just larger in terms of penetration. Not in absolute numbers, nothing beats India because of the population size, but just as a ratio of people using these channels, right, tends to be higher there, and some of these concepts tend to trickle down a little bit, although the speed of it is changing a lot, right? Also, the amount of media channels available, right, tends to be slightly higher. Therefore, the fragmentation of media tends to be slightly higher, which means planning media, designing advertising tends to be slightly more challenging. But for me, they're on a continuum. It's not like they're chalk and cheese. They're on a continuum, and the same principles of how to buy media or how to design advertising hold true in both markets.
So I represent a network of various creative freelancers and teams as IndieFolio, and a couple of questions on their behalf, right? So what which has happened is, as you said, there's so much fragmentation. The pressure to create content is very high. And everybody's struggling with it right now. For a lot of brand managers, it's too much to do with the same budget and too quick to do, because of which the briefing process, the overall process of understanding the brand keeps on getting, reduced. And that's why I believe people say the golden era of advertising is over. Today we are not true partners. But we also hear brand building, let's do some performance campaigns or something topical, right? So there is also a lot of, because that works. So we're in a very confused stage, if you ask me, as marketeers and creative people, content creation space. So I wanted to ask you firstly, because you've seen the entire evolution, how is it that you've seen the best way to actually manage this overload of, content coming in? Do you have agencies, in-house teams, both? If you could kind of go and just share a content stack for the 2025 marketer, basically. How do you create? So
there's a famous saying, right? When the world zigs, you got to zag. Maybe try and give you a point of view which is slightly counterintuitive. A successful piece of advertising content, right, has to cut through, which means that people need to notice it. It needs to be enjoyable, engaging. It's got to have a hook, right? So cut through or enjoyability is one axis. Distinctiveness or branding is the other axis, which means that when they see that piece of work, they should think of your brand. If not, that piece of work has failed, because you could have an outstanding piece of creative, but if you think of your competitor's brand and seeing it, you've grown their market share and not yours, right? So these are the two fundamental axes with which to look at any kind of advertising work, even if it's an influencer doing it for you, because eventually you're running a business. You want volume growth. Here's the thing. Just think about it, right? How many movies launched succeed, right? How many books that are launched succeed? How many Netflix series succeed? A small number, because creativity is not easy to just churn out by the number. Really good, interesting pieces of content aren't possible day in, day out, 100 times a day. But if it's so critical for the advertising to succeed, you have a challenge there, right? Because if on the one hand, you're pushing to make 1,000 pieces of content, on the other hand, only 10% of them are actually cut through enough. Are you really achieving what you want to do, or are you just creating a lot of noise? So I would actually say, despite all this pressure, you got to go back to the first principle, which is that my work needs to cut through. One reel among 15 other reels should stand out, otherwise it's not enough, right? And it needs to stand for my brand, or else it's not good enough. I personally feel that the content strategy for 2025 and beyond is to zag while the world zigs, right? I would encourage all my competitors to make more and more pieces of content. I would love it, right? Because I would do the opposite. I would make fewer pieces of content. I would ensure that it's really distinct for my brand, that nobody will say it's something else. I would ensure that it really cuts through. I'll ensure that I'll give it enough airtime. I'll ensure that, I just keep it on air for long enough that enough number of people see it and therefore change their perception or awareness of my brand. So I think that's for me is where I would start. I actually am very happy when competitors go the other way, because I know then that they're leaving me an opportunity to build a brand.
What happens is FOMO creeps in, right? Saying, hey, they have a YouTube channel with 1 million followers. They're doing so well on Twitter these days. My competition is posting 40 times a month. I'm posting 5 times. The algorithm is the god. Unfortunately, you see pages with 10 posts a year doing very well. You see pages who do 10,000 posts a year doing very well. So, there's no baseline. How do you deal with FOMO then?
I would say the best way to fight off FOMO is to be really clear about what are vanity metrics and what are real metrics. Instagram followership or post likes, etc. Vanity metrics. The real metrics go back again to the first principles, which is that brands grow because more people buy them. Therefore, what is the growth in your user base year on year or quarter on quarter or month on month is a real metric and a very important one. Brands also grow because more and more people know of them or recognize them. So what is your real monthly, quarterly, annual growth in the number of people who know or recognize you, right? Becomes another critical metric. And then there are a few input metrics into this, right? Do people quantitatively value your product as superior to others in the market? Do people quantitatively value your advertising as superior? So there are a few other metrics, right? Is your pricing optimal to get the maximum number of people to try you? If you measure, and it's not many more than this, if you measure these 5 or 6 real metrics, I would say, diligently, consistently, and you see genuine movement on them, I think you can resist FOMO, because you realize that in achieving all of this, you don't need that LinkedIn post, right? Or you don't need that influencer campaign, or you might need it. I'm not saying that the answer is yes or no, but if it ladders to this one of these real metrics moving, it's an important action for you. If it doesn't add up to one of these real metrics moving, it's not an important action for you.
Absolutely agree. I think, it's a hard pill to swallow, but it's extremely important. And more than I think the young marketers, it's the senior folks, who are taking decisions, who need to kind of understand that, hey, this is what, is the reality today. And as you said, don't follow the competition, follow your own numbers and have clarity there. There's also some fear among creative people where a couple of things are happening. You're seeing that brands are doing a lot of in-housing these days. And then there's also agentic AI, which, increasingly seems to maybe empower anybody like a marketer to actually generate and create. What's your outlook there? I'm asking a question on behalf of, let's say, agency founders or freelancers, saying, what's really the future of creative outsourcing?
It'll have to be a nuanced answer, right? Because the way AI is evolving, literally, I was speaking to an AI expert last week, and one advice to me was, if you can imagine it, it can do it. And therefore, what AI can do is therefore limited today largely by what we can imagine, right? And we haven't even started imagining that aggressively. So I'll stay off a prediction, right? Because it's tough. Let me try and talk about some of the definite changes that can happen, right? And may not happen. I think AI will definitely crash production or change the production industry dramatically. right? I think that's already beginning to happen, right? And that's not still creative. That's definitely production. I think yes, a lot of clients will jump onto the bandwagon of issuing their briefs, right, to AI agents, right, for scripts. Some of that will definitely start happening, right, because it's tempting, right? Like they say, every brand manager is a frustrated creative director, and every creative director is a frustrated ad maker or a filmmaker, right? So I can imagine it happening, that people kind of, putting in a prompt in an AI agent and asking for a script. I think some of that will keep happening. I would say that in all of this noise, this is the best time in the world to actually create really compelling long-form content. Netflix and Amazon Prime was a proof of that, right? People used to watch 1.5 hour, 2 hour movies are happy to watch 10 hour, 15 hour, 16-hour marathons. If anything, storytelling has become slower, right? And more detailed and more nuanced than it has ever in the past, right? Because, people are definitely willing to spend a lot more time with engaging content. And that's a very contrary view to the fact that attention spans are crashing and people can only think for 5 seconds and 10 seconds. The reality is very different. People are seeing 16-hour pieces of content, right, regularly all over the world, because true storytelling is what gives you a consistent look across multiple mediums. I think if creators have the confidence to just keep those first principles in mind and sharpen those skills, I think that bunch of creators will not get replaced, because the value that they add will be largely timeless. But if you go to follow the fad and chase the fad and recalibrate for only influencers and reels, I think, yes, AI is going to really come knocking at the door.
I want to though also understand the perspective of generally in-housing. Everybody can become a designer or a marketeer, a business person, as long as they can think the right questions. Wouldn't then it make sense for a brand to, let's say, just hire these people, right, in-house versus going to an agency or outsourcing it to somebody? So with AI coming in strong and enabling creative people or anybody to generate and produce, you think that it'll all become in-house, or will there still be a lot of AI creative outsourcing, for the lack of a better word?
I think a lot of people will try the in-house model, right? Also because many startups do it, right? And they tend to get a lot of the press on the fact that the creative was made in-house, and there's a cool factor to it. There's almost kind of patting yourself on the back for the fact that we made it internally. We didn't have to go to somebody, right? So, and I'm not passing a judgment here. I'm saying it can work, right? So a lot of people are going to try it. But if you go back, a good creative brings a skill set that the company does not have to the table, right? Because it's a different way of seeing a public. That it's a diversity of thinking that makes a creative different from a client. Now, what can happen is that if you take really creative people and put them in your midst and you're a business operation, right, chasing numbers every day, you run the risk of making them like you, right? And then you might lose the essence of who they are, right? But this is a risk. I'm not saying it can't work. Like, if the company has a maturity to see them as, listen, they bring a different skill set, and therefore manage them differently, let them have the opportunity to work on multiple brands, right? So I think a house of brands kind of company can in-house. Because, the fact that they will work with very different brands and very different consumers means that their creative brain is exercised. But I genuinely believe that if you're surrounded by salespeople and you're working on one brand all your life, you will lose that creative edge, right? Because you're not being challenged in any different way. I think companies will find this out over time. Some will succeed. I think those who succeed would have created a culture where they're treated slightly differently because they are distinct kind of mindsets that they bring to the table. And hopefully they have many products and many brands to work on, so that they don't get jaded and they don't kind of start having a unitrack mind to the creative problem.
Very interesting. I think for a lot of agency founders, I think it just talks about the importance of like building like career laddering, for your, right, where they need to aspire, do more good thing, have variety, because that is what they will not get in-house. And maybe that is why even the best talent will end up working with you, because they don't get stuck to one thing. In fact, I constantly see the best creative people open their own studios and shops, right? Because they're capable of quite a lot of things. So this is a very interesting perspective that, like, and actually a great way to stay relevant is to make sure that you always have the best people in your company and the best creative people are thriving in your agency. So I think that's a very nice perspective. You worked with a lot of agencies, I'm sure, over your career. What separates a great agency from a good agency, according to you?
One of my early bosses once told me that there's no good or bad agency and there's only good or bad clients. I will answer your question, but there is a grain of truth there, right? In the sense that, in a way, clients get the agencies that they deserve, right? And clients get the work that they deserve as well. To go back to the aphorism that all brand managers are frustrated creative directors and all creative directors are frustrated artists, I would, for me, the great agencies are the ones that understand what the end goal is, and the end goal is that a brand needs to grow its volumes, and their product is unique, as in the creative director's product is unique because a brand team cannot do it. But again, the creative director is not creating a work of obscure art to satisfy an artistic drive, right? The creative director is to create something which will get millions of people to like it, recognize it, and hopefully buy the brand, right? And in that marriage, there could be areas where the client shows data, testing data, consumer data, etc. I find that the great creative directors and the great agencies are open to that feedback because they know that they're not creating art. They're creating artistic advertising, but they're creating advertising, and that's got to sell the brand eventually. The second one is, I think great agencies need to have a point of view, right? And be willing to fight for a point of view, correct? Because again, creativity is something that the client is often not able to do. And great creativity does break a few boundaries and does push the envelope or just seem a little edgy. Some agencies will, after you give them a brief, organize something called a tissue session. And what they do there is they'll go and give you 20 scripts and 20 ideas, right? And say, now you tell us the top 3 that you want. For me, that's the sign that you're working with a bad agency. I'm as simple as that, because there's an absolute lack of point of view there. They're throwing all their problems at you and saying, now you make a call. Where the objective is more to keep the client happy and to produce really cut-through, edgy work. So it's my internal filter. Right? When I hear of a tissue session, I tend to know, okay, I'm not working with the best here. Another point there, right? I hire an agency for them to have a point of view on my consumer, right? I don't hire an agency for them to be a buffet, right? And kind of have that point of view, because then I would do it internally. Maybe, and secondly, I think a tissue session is designed for the client, not designed for the consumer. But I want somebody who will design for my consumer, because my consumer to buy is my product, and it's more of them that I want to buy my product, right? So that I can grow. And then for me, that definitely differentiates great from good.
Thank you so much for all your frameworks, actually, more than anything. I love frameworks. Last question, right? If anybody wants to become a CMO one day, and I'm a young marketer right now watching this, what are the top best practices for me to increase my chances of becoming a marketing leader?
Interesting, right? I think there's a saying, right? You are at any point at the half-life of any idea or company or whatever. If a company is 20 years old, there's a good chance it will reach 40. Right? If a company is 100 years old, there's a good chance it will reach 200. Or similarly, if a book is 50 years old, there's a good chance it will reach 100. But if a book is 1 year old, you can only bet on 2, right? You can't bet on 3 necessarily, right? You're always at the half-life of anything at any point in time. And therefore, I would say that to get an understanding of marketing, it's good to go back to, let's say, the books and the experts whose ideas have stood the test of time. Because if an idea has lasted 15 years in a day and age like this, there's a good chance it'll last 15 years more. If an idea has lasted 30 years, there's a good chance it'll last 30 years more. And I would say that's always a better place to start than with the almost testosterone-driven stuff that you see on social media every day saying, I did this and I did that, and I have $1 million of sale in 2 days because I did this. Because those ideas are still relatively new and their half-life could be another 2 months. I would say go back to the tried and tested. There's a handful of books that have stood the test of time and kind of make the foundational reading list for most great marketeers. I would say stick to those. So like all of the Byron Sharp and his cohorts, all of their books, How Brands Grow, etc. And the sequels that have come out from them. Positioning by Rees and Trout. Again, some people criticize it, but it's fairly timeless. It takes one simple idea and gives it an explanation as to what it is. And with the half-life principle, will stand the test of time also. I would say start from there. I think secondly, try and find great marketing mentors, because there's nothing like that. And I was fortunate to have some fantastic marketing mentors. And in my career so far, I would say that probably 10% of my time has given me 90% of my learning. And the remaining 90% of my time has been implementing and failing or succeeding in those learnings. But 10% of my time with select exceptional marketing leaders has been where I've got my learning. So if you happen to find one, latch on and get as much as you can out of them, or go looking for one, right? And today with social media, it's much easier to find people, and a lot more people are willing to be coaches and mentors and all of that online. So I would say that is a better model than YouTube University.
Thank you so much. This marks the end of the podcast. I hope you had fun.
Yeah, it was great. I had good fun.
And for everybody who's tuned in, if you like the session and you'd like another marketing leader, please like, share and subscribe. A new episode will come out very, very soon. Bye-bye.